Most people believe they are thinking clearly. That is the first illusion. We move through our days forming opinions, making decisions, reacting to news, judging people, planning our future, and rarely do we stop to examine how those thoughts were formed. We assume that because a thought appears in our mind, it must be reasonable. But thinking, in its raw and natural form, is not refined. It is automatic, emotional, biased, and heavily influenced by environment. Critical thinking begins the moment we realize that our first thought is not always our best thought. At its core, critical thinking is not about intelligence. It is about discipline. It is about slowing down the rush of conclusions and asking quiet, deliberate questions. Why do I believe this? What evidence supports it? What might I be missing? These questions sound simple, but they require courage. Because when we question our own thinking, we challenge our identity. Our beliefs are often tied to who we think we are. To examine them feels uncomfortable. The human brain is wired for efficiency, not accuracy. It prefers shortcuts. Psychologists call these shortcuts cognitive biases. They help us make quick decisions in uncertain situations, but they also distort reality. Confirmation bias, for example, pushes us to seek information that supports what we already believe. If we think a person is unreliable, we will notice every mistake they make and ignore their strengths. If we believe a certain investment is promising, we will search for positive news and dismiss warnings. The brain protects its prior conclusions. Critical thinking requires stepping outside that protective bubble. It asks us to hold our beliefs lightly, as hypotheses rather than truths. Instead of saying, "This is how it is," we learn to say, "This is how it appears to me right now." That subtle shift opens space for growth. It transforms thinking from a fixed structure into a flexible process. Another obstacle to clear thinking is emotion. Emotions are not the enemy. They carry valuable information. Fear alerts us to danger. Anger signals injustice. Excitement points to opportunity. But emotions can hijack reasoning when left unchecked. When we are angry, we interpret neutral actions as hostile. When we are afraid, we overestimate risks. When we are overly confident, we underestimate challenges. A critical thinker does not suppress emotion. Instead, they notice it. They pause and ask, "Is this emotion guiding me or controlling me?" That pause creates distance. And in that small distance, clarity begins to form. The ability to separate feelings from facts is one of the strongest foundations of sound judgment. Assumptions are another hidden force shaping our thoughts. We carry them silently. Assumptions about people, about success, about failure, about what is possible. Most of them were formed early in life and have never been consciously tested. If someone believes, deep down, that they are not good with money, every financial mistake reinforces that belief. If someone assumes that others cannot be trusted, they will interpret neutral behavior as betrayal. To improve critical thinking, we must learn to surface these assumptions and examine them. Where did this belief come from? Is it based on evidence or repetition? Has it been tested recently? Many assumptions survive simply because they are never questioned. Clear thinking also demands clarity of language. Vague words produce vague thoughts. When someone says, "This plan is risky," what does risky actually mean? Risky compared to what? What is the probability of failure? What is the potential loss? Precision in language forces precision in thought. The more specific we become, the less room there is for distortion. There is also the influence of social pressure. Humans are social creatures. We want to belong. When a group shares a strong opinion, it becomes uncomfortable to disagree. This is why entire communities can hold flawed beliefs for long periods of time. It feels safer to conform than to question. But critical thinking often requires standing alone, at least temporarily. It requires the willingness to say, "I'm not convinced yet." This does not mean being argumentative or cynical. It means being thoughtfully independent. A critical thinker listens carefully, considers opposing views, and remains open. But openness is not the same as acceptance. Ideas must earn their place through evidence and reasoning. Another key element is understanding the difference between information and understanding. We live in an age of overwhelming information. News, opinions, statistics, expert commentary, all of it flows endlessly. But information alone does not create wisdom. In fact, more information can create more confusion if not processed. Or is it emotional persuasion? Are alternative interpretations possible? These questions prevent us from being easily manipulated. It is also important to recognize logical fallacies, common errors in reasoning. For example, attacking a person instead of addressing their argument, or assuming that because one event followed another, the first caused the second, or presenting only two options when more exist. These patterns appear constantly in media, debates, and everyday conversations. Once you begin to recognize them, you see them everywhere, and you become less likely to fall into them yourself. Improving critical thinking is not about becoming skeptical of everything. It is about becoming curious about everything. Curiosity replaces defensiveness. Instead of trying to win arguments, you begin to explore ideas. You ask better questions. You become comfortable saying, "I don't know." And surprisingly, that phrase is not a weakness. It is a starting point for real understanding. There is also humility in strong thinking, the recognition that you can be wrong. History is filled with intelligent people who were absolutely certain, and absolutely mistaken. Certainty feels powerful, but flexibility is stronger. When you allow your views to evolve with new evidence, you grow. Decision making becomes sharper when critical thinking is applied consistently. Before making an important choice, you examine alternatives. You consider second-order consequences, not just what will happen immediately, but what will happen after that. If I choose this path, where does it lead in 5 years? If I ignore this problem now, how large might it become? This kind of thinking reduces impulsive decisions. Over time, practicing critical thinking changes how you see the world. You begin to notice patterns. You become more patient in forming opinions. You react less and reflect more. Conversations become deeper. Conflicts become less emotional and more constructive. And perhaps most importantly, you gain confidence, not the loud confidence of certainty, but the quiet confidence of clarity. But understanding these ideas intellectually is only the beginning. The real challenge lies in applying them consistently in daily life, especially when pressure, emotion, and urgency try to pull you back into automatic thinking. And that is where the deeper work truly begins. If you truly want to think better, you must first accept something uncomfortable. Most mistakes in life are not caused by lack of effort, but by errors in judgment. People work hard, they stay busy, they try their best, yet they still choose wrong partnerships, wrong investments, wrong reactions, wrong priorities. The issue is rarely laziness. It is flawed thinking patterns running quietly in the background. To improve critical thinking in a practical way, you must begin observing your own decisions as if you were an outsider. Imagine watching yourself from a distance. Why did you agree to that request? Why did you reject that opportunity? Why did you trust that person so quickly? When you replay decisions calmly, patterns begin to appear. Maybe you avoid conflict too quickly. Maybe you chase approval. Maybe you fear missing out. These patterns are not random. They form a personal decision-making style. The next step is learning to slow down time, at least mentally. Most poor decisions happen under emotional urgency. Urgency creates pressure, and pressure narrows thinking. When something feels urgent, the brain switches to survival mode. It simplifies options. It pushes for immediate action. But not every urgent feeling requires urgent action. Many situations benefit from deliberate delay. A simple pause can dramatically improve judgment. When faced with an important decision, create space. Step away. Sleep on it. Write down your reasoning. When thoughts are written, they become clearer. Weak logic becomes visible. Emotional exaggeration soften. Writing forces structure, and structure strengthens thought. Another powerful technique is inversion, thinking about what you want to avoid rather than only what you want to achieve. Instead of asking, "How can I succeed?" ask, "How could I fail?" This shift reveals hidden risks. If you want a strong career, think about behaviors that destroy careers: dishonesty, complacency, poor communication. If you want financial stability, consider what leads to financial collapse: uncontrolled debt, emotional spending, blind optimism. Avoiding obvious mistakes is often more powerful than chasing brilliant ideas. It is also important to understand how narratives shape thinking. Humans love stories. We create them constantly. If a business fails, we create a simple explanation. If someone becomes wealthy, we assume a clear cause. But reality is usually more complex. Critical thinking requires resisting simple explanations for complex outcomes. It asks, what other factors could be involved? What don't I see? What information is missing? Rarely is any outcome driven by a single cause. Another crucial element is understanding probability. Many decisions are not about certainty but likelihood. People often treat uncertain outcomes as if they are guaranteed. If a risky investment worked once, they assume it will work again. If something bad happened once, they assume it will always happen. But intelligent thinking evaluates chances, not absolutes. Instead of asking, "Will this work?" ask, "What is the probability this will work, and what are the consequences if it fails?" This approach balances optimism with realism. It prevents extreme thinking, the kind that swings between overconfidence and fear. You must also learn to separate identity from opinion. This is one of the most difficult mental shifts. When someone challenges your idea, it should not feel like they are attacking you personally, but often it does. When identity is attached to belief, discussion turns defensive. Growth stops. If you can say, "This is my current understanding, but I am open to refinement," you create space for improvement. You become more interested in truth than in being right. That small internal change dramatically elevates the quality of your conversations and decisions. There is also a hidden trap in intelligence itself. Intelligent people can become better at justifying wrong conclusions. They build sophisticated arguments around weak foundations. They defend flawed assumptions with complex reasoning. Critical thinking is not about constructing impressive arguments. It is about testing whether the foundation is solid. Ask yourself regularly, what evidence would change my mind? If the answer is nothing, then you are not thinking critically. You are protecting a belief. Surrounding yourself with diverse perspectives is another powerful practice. If everyone around you thinks the same way, blind spots multiply. But diversity is not just about background. It is about intellectual diversity. Seek people who disagree respectfully. Listen carefully, not to respond, but to understand. Disagreement, when handled calmly, sharpens thought. However, not all opinions deserve equal weight. Evidence matters. Expertise matters. Experience matters. Critical thinking includes knowing whose input carries depth and whose is merely noise. In a world where everyone has a platform, discernment becomes essential. It is also useful to distinguish between first-order and second-order thinking. First-order thinking focuses on immediate outcomes. If I say this, what happens next? If I invest here, what is the short-term gain? Second-order thinking goes further. If this works, what new challenges appear? If this fails, what doors close permanently? Many long-term consequences are invisible at first glance. People who consistently apply second-order thinking often avoid disasters others walk into confidently. They see the ripple effects before they happen. Self-awareness plays a central role in all of this. Notice when you are tired, stressed, or emotionally triggered. These states reduce cognitive quality. Important decisions made while exhausted often reflect impulse rather than clarity. Recognizing your mental state before deciding is not weakness. It is discipline. Over time, strengthening critical thinking becomes less about techniques and more about mindset. It becomes a habit of reflection, a quiet skepticism toward your own immediate reactions, a steady commitment to evidence over assumption. You begin to notice that many arguments in the world are fueled not by facts but by ego, fear, and misunderstanding. And instead of being pulled into every debate, you become selective. You engage where thought can be productive. You withdraw where emotion dominates. This does not make you detached. It makes you deliberate. And as this mental discipline deepens, something interesting happens. You start to see how thinking shapes not only decisions but identity itself. The quality of your thoughts gradually determines the direction of your life. But there is still one more layer to explore, the inner resistance that appears when you try to change how you think. That resistance is subtle, powerful, and often invisible until you face it directly. There is a quiet resistance that appears the moment you try to improve the way you think. It does not shout. It does not argue loudly. It whispers subtle excuses. This is just who I am. I've always done it this way. It's not that serious. And without noticing, you slip back into familiar mental patterns. The mind loves familiarity. Even flawed thinking feels some past decisions were based on incomplete reasoning. That process can feel destabilizing. This is why improving critical thinking is not just an intellectual exercise. It is emotional work. It requires patience with yourself. When you discover that you were wrong about something important, the goal is not self-criticism. The goal is refinement. Every corrected mistake strengthens future judgment. One of the strongest internal barriers to better thinking is ego. Ego is not arrogance in the loud sense. It is the quiet need to appear consistent, competent, and certain. Admitting uncertainty feels like weakness. Changing your mind feels like defeat. But in reality, the opposite is true. The ability to update your thinking when new evidence appears is a sign of strength. Imagine two people presented with new information that contradicts their belief. The first becomes defensive. They search for flaws in the information. They dismiss it quickly. They protect their previous stance. The second pauses. They examine the new evidence carefully. They consider the possibility that their earlier understanding was incomplete. Over time, who grows faster? Who adapts better to changing environments? The world is not static. Technology shifts. Markets evolve. Social norms change. If your thinking remains rigid, you slowly disconnect from reality. Flexible thinking is not about having no principles. It is about holding principles while allowing strategies and interpretations to evolve. Another subtle resistance comes from mental laziness. Deep thinking requires effort. It requires attention. It asks you to analyze, compare, question, and reflect. In a world full of distractions, this level of focus is rare. Quick opinions are easier. Emotional reactions are easier. Repeating popular narratives is easier. But easy thinking often produces expensive consequences. To strengthen mental discipline, you must deliberately practice focused attention. When reading something important, read slowly. When listening to someone explain an idea, resist the urge to prepare your response while they are still speaking. Truly understand their argument before evaluating it. This alone dramatically improves clarity. There is also value in deliberately exposing yourself to complex material. Difficult ideas stretch the mind. They force you to hold multiple variables at once. They train you to tolerate ambiguity without rushing toward premature conclusions. Over time, your tolerance for complexity increases. You stop needing simple answers for every complicated issue. A powerful habit in developing strong thinking is reflection. At the end of a major decision, revisit it later. Not to regret, but to evaluate. What assumptions did you make? Which ones were accurate? Which were flawed? Did emotions influence the outcome more than you realized? This kind of post-decision analysis turns experience into wisdom. Without reflection, experience alone does not guarantee improvement. Many people repeat the same mistakes for decades because they never pause to analyze them. It is also important to understand how environment shapes thought. The people you spend time with, the media you consume, the conversations you entertain, all of these inputs quietly program your perspective. If your environment constantly reinforces shallow thinking, outrage, or oversimplification, your mind absorbs those patterns. Be selective about your inputs. Choose conversations that challenge you constructively. Choose sources that value evidence over drama. Over time, your thinking begins to mirror the quality of your environment. Confidence is another area that requires balance. Too little confidence leads to indecision. You doubt every conclusion. You hesitate endlessly. Too much confidence leads to reckless certainty. You ignore warning signs. True critical thinking lives in the middle. You make decisions with conviction, but you remain open to adjustment. This balance is especially important in leadership and influence. When others rely on your judgment, your thinking must be steady, not impulsive, not emotionally reactive, not rigid. Steady thinking builds trust. People feel safe when decisions are thoughtful rather than impulsive. There is also the skill of asking better questions. The quality of your life is deeply connected to the quality of the questions you ask yourself. Instead of asking, "Why does this always happen to me?" ask, "What can I learn from this pattern?" Instead of asking, "Who is to blame?" ask, "What factors contributed to this outcome?" Blame closes thinking. Curiosity opens it. Asking better questions transforms frustration into investigation. Over time, improved critical thinking begins to affect not only major life decisions but small daily because you pause before assuming intent. Perhaps most importantly, you become more internally stable. External events still happen. Unexpected problems still arise. But your response becomes measured. You analyze before reacting. You evaluate before judging. That stability creates resilience. And yet, even with all these practices, critical thinking remains a lifelong process. There is no final stage where you become immune to bias or error. The goal is not perfection. The goal is consistent improvement. As your thinking sharpens, something deeper begins to emerge. You start recognizing that clear thinking is not just a tool for success or problem solving. It shapes your character. It influences how you treat others, how you handle power, how you respond to uncertainty. The way you think determines the way you live. And when you truly begin to understand that connection, a new question naturally appears, not just how to think better, but how to live in alignment with the clarity you are developing. If you look closely at your life, you will notice a quiet pattern. Every major outcome can be traced back to a decision, and every decision can be traced back to a thought. Before action, there is interpretation. Before interpretation, there is belief. This is why improving critical thinking is not simply a mental upgrade. It is a life upgrade. When your thinking becomes clearer, your standards begin to rise naturally. You become less tolerant of weak arguments, including your own. You stop justifying habits that you know are misaligned with your long-term goals. You become more honest with yourself. That honesty is not harsh. It is calm and direct. Living in alignment with clear thinking means closing the gap between what you know and what you do. Many people understand good principles intellectually. They know impulsive spending is harmful. They know emotional reactions damage relationships. They know consistency beats intensity. Yet in moments of stress or temptation, knowledge disappears. Why? Because clarity without practice fades under pressure. To live critically means applying the same thoughtful analysis to your own behavior that you apply to ideas. When you feel anger rising, instead of reacting immediately, you analyze it. What exactly triggered this? Is my interpretation accurate? Am I responding to the current situation, or to a past memory attached to it? That small investigation transforms reaction into response. Over time, this practice creates emotional maturity. You are no longer controlled by every passing thought. You begin to understand that thoughts are events in the mind, not commands that must be obeyed. Just because you think something does not mean it is true. Just because you feel something does not mean you must act on it. This realization creates freedom. Another important shift happens in how you approach success and failure. Without critical thinking, failure feels personal and final. With deeper thinking, failure becomes data. Instead of saying, "I'm not capable," you ask, "What variable did I miscalculate? What assumption proved wrong?" This removes shame from the learning process. Similarly, success is analyzed carefully. You ask, "Was this result skill, luck, timing, or a combination?" This prevents overconfidence. It keeps your feet on the ground while still allowing satisfaction. Living with sharpened thinking also improves relationships. Many conflicts are not about facts but interpretations. One person assumes disrespect. The other assumes misunderstanding. When you slow down and clarify assumptions, tension often dissolves. You ask directly rather than assuming silently. You verify instead of accusing. Clear thinking promotes empathy. When someone behaves in a way you dislike, instead of immediately labeling them negatively, you consider alternative explanations. Are they stressed? Are they operating under different information? Are they reacting from their own fears? This does not excuse harmful behavior, but it expands understanding. There is also a deeper responsibility that comes with strong thinking. When you see logical flaws in public conversations, in media, in social debates, it becomes tempting to feel intellectually superior. That is another subtle trap. The goal of critical thinking is not superiority. It is clarity and constructive contribution. Use your clarity to elevate conversations, not to dominate them. In practical life, this means you choose your battles wisely. Not every incorrect statement requires correction. Not every disagreement requires debate. Sometimes silence preserves energy. Other times, thoughtful engagement creates value. Discernment becomes key. As you continue developing this mindset, you begin to think more long-term. As you continue developing this mindset, you begin to think more long-term. Short-term pleasure loses some of its grip because you can clearly see future consequences. When tempted by something misaligned with your goals, you mentally project forward. Where does this path lead if repeated? That projection strengthens discipline. This long-term orientation affects finances, health, career, and personal growth. You invest in habits that compound. Reading regularly, exercising consistently, building skills patiently. These actions may seem small daily, but over years they create dramatic differences. There comes a point where improving your thinking is no longer about techniques or mental exercises. It becomes about identity. You no longer try to use critical thinking. You become someone who naturally thinks carefully, and that shift changes everything. At the beginning, questioning your own thoughts feels deliberate and sometimes tiring. You have to remind yourself to pause, to examine evidence, to separate emotion from fact. But with repetition, this process becomes instinctive. Just as the body adapts to physical training, the mind adapts to disciplined reflection. Clear thinking becomes your default setting rather than an effort. This is where real transformation happens. When thoughtful analysis becomes natural, you start to notice how much of the world operates on impulse. You see decisions driven by ego, fear, trends, and social pressure. You recognize how quickly narratives form and spread without verification. And instead of being swept away, you remain steady, not because you know everything, but because you know how to evaluate. One of the most powerful long-term benefits of strong thinking is independence. Not rebellion, not stubbornness. Independence. You are no longer overly dependent on external validation to form your opinions. You are not easily shaken by popular sentiment. At the same time, You are not closed off. You are open, but not gullible. This balance is rare. As you deepen this mindset, you begin to simplify your life. You realize that many complications were created by unclear decisions in the past, poorly evaluated commitments, emotion-driven promises, assumptions left unchecked. With clearer thinking, you become more selective. You say yes more carefully. You say no more confidently. Boundaries improve. Time is protected. Energy is invested wisely. Another quiet shift occurs in how you experience regret. Regret often comes from realizing, too late, that you ignored warning signs or acted emotionally. But when you consistently apply careful thought, even if an outcome fails, regret lessens. You know you evaluated the situation honestly. You made the best decision with the information available. That piece matters. There is also growth in patience. Quick results become less attractive than sustainable progress. You understand that strong foundations matter more than fast appearances. Whether in business, relationships, or personal development, you think in terms of durability rather than excitement. Durability requires analysis. It requires asking difficult questions before committing. What are the long-term costs? What trade-offs am I accepting? What hidden risks exist? Many people avoid these questions because they slow momentum. But thoughtful delay often prevents painful consequences. Over time, your tolerance for discomfort increases. You become comfortable sitting with uncertainty while gathering information. You become comfortable admitting, I need more time to decide. That confidence in patience is a mark of maturity. There is also a moral dimension to critical thinking. Clear thinking helps you act with fairness. When evaluating situations involving others, you seek multiple perspectives. You resist jumping to conclusions. You look for evidence before forming judgments. This reduces unnecessary harm. Strong thinking fosters responsibility. When something goes wrong, instead of immediately blaming external factors, you analyze your own role first. Not to punish yourself, but to understand. This accountability accelerates growth. As your internal clarity strengthens, external noise loses power. Social media outrage cycles feel predictable. Dramatic headlines feel exaggerated. Emotional manipulation becomes easier to detect. You consume information more selectively. You protect your attention. Attention is one of your most valuable resources. Where it goes, your thinking follows. Where thinking goes, life follows. You also begin to notice the compounding nature of mental habits. Just as financial investments grow over time, small improvements in reasoning compound. A slightly better decision today creates a better position tomorrow. That better position, this awareness motivates consistency. You understand that even minor decisions deserve clarity. Perhaps the most profound realization is that critical thinking is not about control. You cannot control every outcome. You cannot predict every variable, but you can control the quality of your evaluation. You can control whether you react blindly or respond thoughtfully. That control is enough. It gives you stability in unstable environments. It gives you direction when others feel lost. It gives you calm when situations grow tense. And as you continue refining this discipline, you notice something unexpected. The more carefully you think, the more humble you become. You see how complex reality truly is. You see how often certainty is misplaced. This humility does not weaken you. It strengthens you. It keeps you learning. Learning becomes lifelong. You read not just to confirm beliefs, but to expand them. You engage in conversations not just to express opinions, but to refine them. Growth becomes continuous rather than occasional. In the end, improving critical thinking is not about winning arguments or appearing intelligent. It is about living deliberately. It is about aligning perception with reality as closely as possible. It is about reducing self-created problems and responding wisely to unavoidable ones. When you cultivate this way of thinking consistently, life does not become perfect. Challenges still arise. Mistakes still happen. But your ability to navigate them improves steadily. And that steady improvement, quiet, disciplined, thoughtful, becomes one of the most reliable advantages you can ever build. If you step back and observe your life from a distance, you may notice something subtle but powerful. The quality of your days is not determined by dramatic events. It is determined by the quality of your decisions. And the quality of your decisions is shaped by how well you think when no one is watching. By now, critical thinking is no longer just a skill you practice occasionally. It has become a lens through which you see everything. And through that lens, you begin to recognize that most problems in life are not sudden. They build quietly. They begin as small unchecked assumptions, small emotional reactions, small ignored doubts. Clear thinking catches problems early, while they are still manageable. This early detection is one of its greatest strengths. Consider how many Conflicts could be avoided if assumptions were clarified sooner. How many financial mistakes could be reduced if risks were evaluated calmly before excitement took over? How many regrets could be prevented if short-term impulses were measured against long-term values? Strong thinking acts like internal quality control. It constantly asks, does this make sense? Is this aligned with reality? Am I missing something important? But there is a deeper layer still. At some point, you realize that improving your thinking is not just about external success or avoiding mistakes. It is about integrity. When your thoughts are disciplined, your actions become more consistent. You stop contradicting yourself. You stop making promises you cannot justify. You stop pursuing goals that do not truly matter to you. Clarity reveals priorities. Many people chase goals because they feel socially impressive, not because they are personally meaningful. When you apply critical thinking inward, you question your motivations. Why do I want this? Is it ego? Is it comparison? Is it genuine purpose? This self-examination prevents years of misplaced effort. Living thoughtfully also improves your relationship with time. You begin to respect it more. You understand that every decision consumes time, attention, and energy. You become less willing to spend those resources carelessly. Distractions lose some of their appeal. You ask whether an activity adds long-term value or simply fills temporary boredom. This does not mean eliminating enjoyment. It means choosing enjoyment consciously rather than impulsively. As your thinking matures, your tolerance for shallow conversations decreases. You seek discussions that explore ideas deeply. You enjoy examining causes and consequences. You appreciate nuance rather than extreme opinions. And you begin to notice that real growth often happens in quiet reflection rather than loud debate. Another powerful transformation is resilience under pressure. When unexpected events occur, economic downturns, professional setbacks, personal disappointments, your first instinct is not panic. It is assessment. What are the facts? What options remain available? What actions are within my control? This structured response reduces emotional chaos. Emotions still exist, but they no longer dominate strategy. You also become more comfortable with of pretending you can have everything. You choose intentionally. That choice creates peace because it is conscious. There is maturity in accepting that not all opportunities are meant for you. Not every argument deserves your energy. Not every trend requires your participation. When your thinking is sharp, you filter wisely. Over years, this filtering shapes your identity. You become known as someone steady, someone who does not overreact, someone who evaluates carefully. People trust your judgment because it is not impulsive, it is measured. And perhaps most importantly, you trust yourself. Self-trust is built through repeated evidence that you can rely on your own reasoning. When faced with difficulty, you know you will analyze rather than escape. When faced with temptation, you know you will consider consequences. That internal reliability reduces anxiety. You are no longer afraid of your own impulses. At its highest level, critical thinking becomes a form of self-respect. You respect your mind enough not to feed it weak information. You respect your future enough to question present impulses. You respect others enough to evaluate them fairly rather than through prejudice or assumption. It is quiet work. No one applauds you for thinking carefully before speaking. No one celebrates the arguments you chose not to start. No one sees the impulsive decision you avoided because you paused and reflected. But those invisible moments accumulate. They shape character. And character shapes destiny. In the end, improving critical thinking is less about becoming sharper in debates and more about becoming wiser in life. It is about seeing reality clearly, acting deliberately, and adjusting humbly when wrong. It is about aligning thought, action, and value. When you cultivate this discipline consistently, you create a life built not on reaction, but on intention. Not on illusion, but on understanding. Not on noise, but on clarity. And that clarity, steady, patient, grounded, becomes one of the most powerful advantages you carry through every stage of your life. There is one final shift that separates someone who occasionally thinks critically from someone who lives critically. It is the realization that your mind is not just a tool for solving problems. It is the environment in which you live every single day. If your mental environment is chaotic, biased, reactive, and cluttered with unchecked assumptions, then even external success will feel unstable. But if your inner thinking is organized, examined, and grounded in reality, then even difficult seasons of life feel manageable. The true benefit of disciplined thinking is not control over the world. It is stability within yourself. At this stage, you begin to notice your thoughts almost the way a scientist observes data. A strong opinion appears in your mind, and instead of immediately defending it, you study it. Where did this come from? Is it based on experience, fear, influence, habit? This distance between you and your thoughts is powerful. It means you are no longer fused with every idea that crosses your mind. This mental separation creates calm. In moments of conflict, instead of escalating quickly, you find yourself asking for clarification. In moments of opportunity, instead of rushing blindly, you evaluate downside risk. In moments of praise, you remain grounded. In moments of criticism, you examine whether there is truth hidden inside it. Your emotional reactions become shorter. Your analytical responses become stronger. Over time, this way of thinking transforms how you handle uncertainty. The future will always contain unknowns. Careers change. Industries evolve. Relationships shift. Health fluctuates. Many people try to eliminate uncertainty by clinging to rigid plans or fixed beliefs. But strong thinkers understand that flexibility is more reliable than rigidity. Instead of demanding certainty, you build adaptability. Adaptability comes from principles. When your thinking is rooted in clear principles, honesty, evidence, long-term reasoning, personal responsibility, you can adjust strategies without losing direction. Circumstances may change, but your decision-making framework remains steady. You also begin to value depth over speed. Quick answers feel less satisfying than well-reasoned conclusions. You take pride not in being the first to respond, but in being thoughtful in your response. This patience often gives you an advantage in environments where others react emotionally. There is also a creative dimension to critical thinking that many people overlook. When you question assumptions deeply enough, you start seeing alternative possibilities. You notice inefficiencies others accept as normal. You identify solutions others ignore. Courage. It means challenging traditions, social expectations, even your own habits. But it is also where progress lives. As your thinking matures further, you become more comfortable with complexity. You accept that multiple truths can exist at the same time. That good people can disagree intelligently. That situations can be both beneficial and risky simultaneously. This ability to hold nuanced perspectives prevents extreme thinking. Extreme thinking is often emotionally satisfying. It simplifies the world into right and wrong, success and failure, good and bad. But reality is rarely that simple. Mature thinking tolerates gray areas without feeling lost. At this level, you also begin to recognize the limits of your knowledge. The more you learn, the more you understand how much remains unknown. This awareness does not discourage you. It humbles you. It keeps you asking questions. It prevents intellectual arrogance. Humility is not self-doubt. It is openness. You remain confident in your reasoning process, but not blindly attached to your conclusions. When stronger evidence appears, you update. When better arguments emerge, you adjust. This adaptability ensures that your thinking evolves with new information rather than becoming outdated. Eventually, critical thinking becomes integrated into your identity so deeply that you no longer consciously practice it. It simply shows up in how you speak, how you listen, how you plan, how you respond. It shapes your leadership. It shapes your relationships. It shapes your ambitions. And perhaps the most meaningful outcome is this: you experience fewer self-inflicted problems. You still face external challenges, everyone does, but you no longer create unnecessary chaos through impulsive decisions or unchecked assumptions. Life becomes cleaner, more intentional. There is a quiet confidence that grows from this. Not loud certainty, not arrogance, but grounded assurance. You trust your process. You know that even if you are wrong, you will correct course thoughtfully. That trust removes fear of making decisions. You act, evaluate, adjust, and continue. In the end, improving critical thinking is not about reaching a final destination where you think perfectly. That place does not exist. It is about committing to continuous refinement. It is about respecting reality enough to question your perceptions. It is about valuing truth more than ego. When you live this way, progress becomes steady. Mistakes become teachers. Conversations become richer. Decisions become stronger. And your life gradually reflects the discipline of your mind. Clear thinking will not guarantee comfort. It will not eliminate uncertainty, but it will give you something far more valuable: the ability to navigate complexity with calm strength. And in a world that moves quickly, reacts emotionally, and rewards noise, that calm strength may be one of the greatest advantages you can build. As your thinking becomes steadier and more deliberate, something subtle begins to change in how you experience the world. You stop feeling rushed by it. The urgency that once pushed you into quick reactions starts to lose its grip. You realize that most situations do not require instant judgment. They require careful understanding. This shift alone can transform the rhythm of your life. When you are no longer mentally rushing, you start noticing details you previously ignored. The tone behind someone's words, the assumptions hidden inside a proposal, the long-term implications behind a short-term reward. Your perception sharpens because you are not clouded by emotional speed. Speed is often mistaken for intelligence. Quick answers impress people. Fast opinions create the appearance of confidence. But depth rarely operates at high speed. Depth requires pause. It requires the willingness to sit with incomplete information without forcing a premature conclusion. As you practice this consistently, you develop a reputation, not necessarily as the loudest voice in the room, but as the most thoughtful. When you speak, people listen more carefully because they sense that your words are measured. They are not thrown into the air impulsively. This careful speech also protects your relationships. Many regrets in life come not from what we did physically, but from what we said emotionally. Words spoken without thought can damage trust in seconds. But when your thinking habitually filters your reactions, you reduce unnecessary harm. Another important transformation is how you relate to mistakes made by others. Earlier in life, it may have been easy to judge quickly, to assume incompetence or bad intention. But disciplined thinking makes you slower to condemn. You understand how easy it is to miscalculate, to act on incomplete data, a single error from a person's overall character. That level of nuance improves leadership, friendship, and partnership alike. As your inner clarity grows, you also become more strategic with your energy. Not every problem is yours to solve. Not every debate deserves your time. Not every opportunity fits your long-term direction. Critical thinking sharpens your ability to prioritize. You begin asking quietly, does this align with my values? Does this contribute to my long-term objectives? Is this a distraction disguised as importance? In a world filled with constant demands, this filtering ability protects your focus. And focus, sustained over years, creates extraordinary results. There is also a deep sense of personal responsibility that develops at this stage. You no longer blame circumstances as easily. You recognize where your own assumptions, blind spots, or rushed decisions played a role. This accountability is empowering rather than discouraging. If your thinking influences outcomes, then improving your thinking improves outcomes. You move from feeling like a victim of randomness to being an active participant in shaping your direction. Over time, this mindset builds resilience that others may struggle to understand. When setbacks occur, you do not collapse into self-pity. You examine variables. You adjust strategy. You look for leverage points. Because you have trained yourself to analyze rather than dramatize, recovery becomes faster. Another profound shift is your relationship with certainty. Early on, certainty feels comforting. It provides stability. But mature thinking teaches you that excessive certainty can be dangerous. It closes doors to new evidence. It prevents adaptation. You become comfortable saying, based on current information, this is my conclusion. That phrasing leaves room for growth. It keeps your thinking alive rather than frozen. This openness also makes you a better learner. You approach books, conversations, and experiences not as confirmation tools, but as expansion tools. You seek to refine your framework, not defend it. Eventually, critical thinking shapes not only how you make decisions, but how you define success itself. Success becomes less about external applause and more about internal alignment. Did I evaluate honestly? Did I act with integrity? Did I consider long-term impact? These questions become more important than immediate results. Because when your thinking process is strong, outcomes, whether positive or negative, become easier to handle. You also begin to appreciate simplicity. Not simplistic thinking, but clear thinking. You reduce unnecessary mental clutter. You stop overcomplicating what can be resolved through calm analysis. You learn to identify the core issue beneath surface noise. This clarity creates peace. Peace not because life is easy, but because your inner framework is stable. You know how to approach problems. You know how to evaluate risk. You know how to correct mistakes. That predictability within yourself is deeply reassuring. And as the years pass, you may look back and realize that the greatest advantage you ever developed was not a specific skill, title, or opportunity. It was the discipline to think clearly when it mattered most. Clear thinking shapes choices. Choices shape habits. Habits shape character. And character shapes destiny. In the end, improving critical thinking is not about becoming flawless. It is about becoming intentional. It is about reducing self-deception. It is about responding to reality with honesty and courage. When you commit to that path, day after day, decision after decision, you build something rare, a mind that works for you rather than against you. And that, more than anything else, quietly determines the direction and quality of your entire life. If you continue walking this path long enough, you begin to realize that clear thinking is not just a personal advantage, it is a quiet responsibility. The way you think influences the way you act, and the way you act influences the people around you. Families are shaped by decisions. Teams are shaped by judgment. Communities are shaped by collective reasoning. When your thinking improves, your impact improves. At this stage, you are no longer practicing critical thinking only to avoid mistakes or make better choices. You practice it because you understand the weight of influence. A parent who reacts impulsively can pass insecurity to a child. A leader who refuses to question assumptions can lead an entire organization into preventable failure. A citizen who accepts information blindly can contribute to confusion and division. Clear thinking, therefore, becomes ethical. It asks you to verify before sharing, to understand before criticizing. You also begin to notice how emotional contagion spreads. Fear spreads, anger spreads, outrage spreads, but so does calm. When you remain measured in tense situations, others often stabilize around you. When you analyze rather than escalate, you interrupt cycles of overreaction. This is leadership at its most subtle level. You do not need a formal title to lead. The way you think and respond sets a tone. In difficult conversations, you bring clarity. In uncertain times, you bring structure. In moments of confusion, you bring questions that illuminate rather than inflame. Over time, this steadiness becomes part of your identity. People may not describe it in technical terms, but they feel it. They trust your judgment. They seek your perspective when decisions matter. Not because you claim to know everything, but because you have demonstrated care in how you reach conclusions. And yet, even at this level, humility remains essential. The moment you believe your thinking is beyond bias, you become vulnerable again. Growth continues only if self-examination continues. It helps to remember that the mind naturally drifts toward comfort. Even a disciplined thinker can slowly become rigid. That is why periodic reflection is necessary. What beliefs have I not questioned recently? Where might I be overconfident? What perspectives have I avoided because they challenge me? These questions keep your thinking flexible. There is also a spiritual dimension to all of this, even if you do not define it in religious terms. Clear thinking connects you more honestly to reality. You stop distorting situations to protect ego. You stop rewriting events to preserve pride. You see things more as they are, and less as you wish them to be. This honesty can be uncomfortable, but it is freeing. When you no longer need to maintain illusions, your energy becomes available for progress. You are not defending fragile narratives. You are building on solid ground. As the years move forward, you may notice that your goals evolve. Earlier ambitions driven by comparison may lose their intensity. Instead, you become motivated by contribution, by mastery, by meaning. Because thoughtful examination often reveals that external validation is unstable, while internal coherence is durable. You begin to measure success differently. Did I approach this decision with integrity? Did I consider consequences responsibly? Did I treat others fairly in my evaluation? These internal metrics provide stability even when external outcomes fluctuate. And perhaps the most powerful outcome of sustained critical thinking is peace with complexity. You accept that life will always include uncertainty, disagreement, and risk. You no longer demand perfect clarity before acting. You gather the best available evidence, reason carefully, and move forward with awareness. When mistakes occur, you correct them. When new data appears, you update. When uncertainty remains, you proceed cautiously rather than freezing. This rhythm, analyze, decide, adjust, becomes natural. In the end, improving critical thinking is not about becoming detached from emotion or hyper-analytical in every moment. It is about balance. Emotion informs you. Reason guides you. Together, they create wisdom. Wisdom is not loud. It does not rush. It does not seek constant validation. It observes, reflects, and acts with intention. If you build this discipline steadily, year after year, you will likely find that your life feels less chaotic than it once did. Not because chaos disappeared, but because your response to it matured. You stopped reacting blindly. You stopped accepting ideas unexamined. You stopped allowing temporary emotion to dictate permanent decisions. And in doing so, you built something far more valuable than quick intelligence or sharp debate skills. You built a reliable mind. A mind that questions before concluding. A mind that pauses before reacting. A mind that adjusts when wrong. A mind that values truth over ego. That kind of mind does not just improve decisions. It improves character. And over a lifetime, character quietly determines the direction of everything else. Clear thinking is not dramatic. It is steady. It is patient. It is often invisible. But when practiced consistently, it becomes one of the strongest foundations a person can ever build. And once you have built it, every area of your life rests on stronger ground. After a long journey of refining how you think, you eventually arrive at a quiet realization. The goal was never to become intellectually superior. The goal was to become internally aligned. To think in a way that reduces confusion, minimizes self-sabotage, and strengthens your relationship with reality. At this final stage, critical thinking, it shapes how you respond to success and failure. It shapes how you define truth. And perhaps most importantly, it shapes how you see yourself. Many people spend years trapped in narratives they never examined. I'm bad at business. I'm unlucky. People can't be trusted. I always fail. These beliefs feel real because they have been repeated often. But when you develop the discipline to question your own mental stories, you begin to separate fact from repetition. You ask, what evidence truly supports this belief? Is this universally true, or based on selective memory? Have I ignored counterexamples? Often, you discover that your identity was built on incomplete data. That discovery is liberating. You realize that your mind is not a courtroom delivering final verdicts. It is a laboratory constantly testing hypotheses. And when a hypothesis proves weak, you replace it. This flexibility reshapes confidence. Confidence no longer means being certain about everything. It means trusting your ability to evaluate carefully and adjust intelligently. It means knowing that even if you are wrong, you will recognize it and recalibrate. There is deep stability in that. As your thinking matures fully, you also recognize the limits of control. You can analyze thoroughly. You can evaluate probabilities. You can act with discipline. But outcomes still depend on variables beyond you. Markets shift. Other people make unpredictable decisions. Circumstances change without warning. Strong thinking does not eliminate risk. It prepares you for it. You become less attached to specific outcomes and more attached to sound processes. Did I gather sufficient information? Did I consider alternative viewpoints? Did I account for downside risk? If the answer is yes, you move forward calmly. If the result differs from expectation, you examine the gap without panic. This process-oriented mindset protects your mental health. It reduces overreaction to setbacks and prevents overconfidence in victories. It keeps you centered. There is also a sense of quiet gratitude that can develop. When you reflect on how many misunderstandings, arguments, poor investments, and emotional regrets you have avoided simply by pausing and thinking clearly, you begin to appreciate the discipline itself. It may not be visible to others, but you know the difference. You know how easily things could have gone wrong. You know how different your path might have been if you had reacted instead of reflected. And yet, the journey never truly ends. Even the most disciplined thinker must remain vigilant. Fatigue weakens reasoning. Stress narrows perspective. Success can create complacency. That is why continuous reflection remains essential. Not obsessive self-doubt, but steady self-awareness. From time to time, you step back and ask yourself, am I still thinking carefully? Have I become too certain in any area? Am I listening enough? Am I challenging myself, or only consuming information that confirms my comfort? These questions keep your mind sharp. Eventually, you may notice that the greatest benefit of critical thinking is not sharper decisions alone, but deeper peace. You are no longer constantly pulled by every emotional wave. You are no longer easily manipulated by dramatic narratives. You are no longer trapped by untested assumptions. You feel grounded. Grounded not because life is simple, but because your internal compass is reliable. When something feels wrong, you investigate. When something feels promising, you analyze. When uncertainty appears, you assess rather than avoid. This grounded state influences how others experience you. You become someone people can rely on during uncertainty. Your presence feels stable. Your advice feels measured. Not perfect, not all-knowing, but thoughtful. And that may be the highest expression of improved critical thinking, becoming a source of clarity in environments that are often clouded by noise. In the end, the discipline to think clearly is an act of respect. Respect for truth. Respect for consequences. Respect for your future self. Respect for the people affected by your decisions. It requires courage to question yourself. It requires patience to analyze carefully. It requires humility to admit error. But the reward is profound. A life directed by intention rather than impulse. A character shaped by reflection rather than reaction. A mind trained to seek understanding rather than comfort. When you build that kind of mind, you carry an advantage that no external circumstance can easily take away. Because while the world will continue to change rapidly, unpredictably, sometimes chaotically, your ability to think clearly remains a steady anchor. And in the long run, that anchor quietly determines the depth, quality of your life. Not instantly, not dramatically, but steadily. Every day, you wake up and interpret reality. You interpret what people say. You interpret events. You interpret risks, opportunities, tone, silence, feedback, failure, success. And from those interpretations, you decide. Then those decisions accumulate. That accumulation becomes your life story. When your thinking is careless, your life feels chaotic. When your thinking is reactive, your life feels unstable. But when your thinking is deliberate, your life gains direction. At this final level of maturity, critical thinking is no longer something you consciously apply in special situations. It becomes the quiet standard you bring to everything. When you hear a claim, you instinctively ask for evidence. When you feel a strong emotion, you instinctively pause. When you face a choice, you instinctively weigh long-term consequences. This instinct is trained, not inherited. And what makes it powerful is consistency. Not perfection, consistency. You will still make mistakes. You will still misjudge situations. You will still underestimate risks or overestimate opportunities at times. But the difference now is recovery speed. Because you are honest with yourself, you detect errors faster. Because you are humble, you adjust sooner. Because you are disciplined, you do not repeat the same mistake endlessly. That is growth in its purest form. Another important realization emerges here. Critical thinking protects your freedom. A mind that cannot question is easily controlled. A mind that reacts emotionally is easily manipulated. But a mind that examines carefully cannot be pushed as easily by fear, by social pressure, or by persuasive rhetoric. Freedom begins internally. When you control the pace and quality of your thoughts, you reduce the influence of external noise. Trends lose their urgency. Panic loses its power. Popular opinion loses its automatic authority. You listen, you evaluate, and only then do you decide. This internal freedom does not isolate you from the world. It strengthens your participation in it. You contribute thoughtfully instead of impulsively. You build instead of react. You create instead of complain. Over time, this approach shapes your legacy. Legacy is not built in one grand moment. It is built in thousands of small decisions handled with clarity. The way you respond to pressure, the fairness of your judgments, the steadiness of your leadership, the patience in your relationships. All of these are products of disciplined thinking. And perhaps the most beautiful aspect of this journey is that it remains accessible at every stage of life. You do not need special talent to think better. You need willingness. Willingness to pause. Willingness to question yourself. Willingness to examine evidence honestly. Willingness to admit error. These are choices available to anyone. As the years pass, you may notice that what once felt complex becomes simpler, not because the world simplified, but because your framework strengthened. You know how to break problems down. You know how to separate signal from noise. You know how to identify what truly matters. This clarity brings confidence, but a grounded kind of confidence. Not loud, not performative, just steady. When faced with uncertainty, you do not rush to eliminate discomfort. You gather information. You assess risk. You act proportionally. When faced with disagreement, you listen before responding. When faced with success, you remain analytical rather than complacent. This balance, between emotion and reason, between confidence and humility, between action and reflection, is the hallmark of a mature mind. And in the end, that mature mind becomes your greatest asset. Money can be lost. Titles can fade. External validation can disappear. But a disciplined, reflective, adaptable mind travels with you through every season. It helps you rebuild when necessary. It helps you pivot when conditions change. It helps you stay grounded when others lose direction. If there is one final insight to carry forward, it is this: your mind is not fixed. It is trainable, and the training never truly ends. Every conversation is practice. Every decision is practice. Every disagreement is practice. Every mistake is practice. You refine. You adjust. You learn. You continue. In a world that often rewards speed over depth and reaction over reflection, choosing to think carefully is almost a quiet rebellion. But it is a rebellion that pays lifelong dividends. Because when you master the discipline of clear, honest, patient thinking, you do more than improve decisions. You shape a life guided not by impulse, not by illusion, not by noise, but by understanding. And understanding, applied consistently over time, a well-trained mind. Because once you truly understand how powerful thinking is, you cannot return to careless reasoning without feeling the cost of it. You begin to see how fragile conclusions really are, how easily people confuse confidence with correctness, how often loud opinions replace careful examination, and instead of feeling frustration toward the world, you feel a deeper sense of responsibility toward yourself. You recognize that every conclusion you reach shapes your actions. Every action influences outcomes, and outcomes ripple outward into the lives of others. This awareness makes you slower to judge and faster to understand. You notice that most disagreements are not battles between intelligence and ignorance. They are conflicts between different assumptions, different experiences, different information. Once you understand this, conversations shift. Instead of attacking conclusions, you explore foundations. What are we each assuming to be true? What information are we relying on? Where do our perspectives differ? This level of dialogue requires patience, but it produces clarity instead of hostility. As your thinking continues to mature, you also become more conscious of cognitive fatigue. You understand that a tired mind makes weaker decisions. You learn to protect your mental energy. You avoid making major commitments when emotionally drained. You step back when overwhelmed. This is not avoidance. It is strategic timing. Strong thinking requires a strong mental state. Just as athletes rest to maintain performance, disciplined thinkers rest to maintain clarity. They recognize that decision quality declines under stress, distraction, and overload. There is also a growing sensitivity to self-deception. You become aware of how easily the mind can rationalize what it wants. You catch yourself when you begin bending logic to justify convenience. You notice when you selectively search for supportive evidence while ignoring contradictions. This self-awareness does not make you harsh. It makes you honest. And honesty with yourself is one of the rarest strengths a person can develop. As time goes on, your relationship with uncertainty becomes almost comfortable. You no longer panic when answers are incomplete. You understand that not knowing is part of the process. Instead of forcing clarity prematurely, you gather more information, consult different perspectives, and wait when necessary. Waiting, when done intentionally, is not weakness. It is strategy. You also begin to recognize patterns in your own history. Situations where you acted too quickly, moments where you hesitated too long, periods when emotion clouded judgment. These reflections are no longer sources of regret. They are sources of calibration. You refine your instincts by studying your past. And perhaps the most meaningful evolution at this stage is compassion, both for yourself and for others. Once you deeply understand how complex thinking truly is, how many biases quietly influence perception, how many unseen factors shape behavior, you become less rigid in your expectations. You still value accountability. You still expect responsibility. But you approach mistakes with curiosity before condemnation. This balance is powerful. It allows you to remain principled without becoming inflexible. It allows you to remain analytical without becoming cold. It allows you to remain confident without becoming arrogant. Eventually, critical thinking blends seamlessly into wisdom. And wisdom is not merely the ability to analyze data or detect logical flaws. It is the ability to see the bigger picture, to weigh short-term gain against long-term meaning, to recognize when to speak and when to stay silent, to know when to act decisively and when to observe patiently. Wisdom integrates thought and character. At this point, your life feels less reactive and more intentional than ever before, not because you control every variable, but because you control your approach. You respond proportionally. You adjust thoughtfully. You remain grounded during both praise and pressure. You begin to trust your inner framework fully, not because it is flawless, but because it is honest and adaptable. And that may be the final reward of improving critical thinking, a deep, stable alignment between how you think and how you live. No constant inner contradiction, no loud internal chaos, no impulsive decisions that betray your values. Just steady evaluation, clear intention, consistent growth. The world will continue to change. Opinions will clash. Information will multiply. Technology will accelerate. But a disciplined mind remains one of the few stable anchors available. When you cultivate that anchor patiently over years, it becomes part of who you are, not for the rest of your life. At the very end of this journey, when you strip everything back to its essence, improving critical thinking comes down to one quiet commitment: refusing to lie to yourself, not exaggerating your strengths, not ignoring your weaknesses, not twisting facts to protect comfort, not pretending certainty where there is doubt. It sounds simple, but it may be one of the hardest disciplines a person can adopt. Because the human mind is protective. It wants comfort. It wants stability. It wants to feel right. And sometimes the easiest way to feel stable is to avoid questioning what we already believe. But growth demands something different. It demands courage. The courage to look at your own reasoning and ask, calmly and honestly, is this actually true? When you make that question a habit, your entire inner world begins to sharpen. You start catching exaggerations in your own thinking. When something goes wrong, instead of saying, "This always happens," you pause and ask, "Is that accurate, or am I reacting emotionally?" When someone disappoints you, instead of concluding, "They don't respect me," you examine whether that interpretation is the only explanation. These small corrections prevent large distortions. Over years, they shape a mind that is stable, fair, and deeply grounded. Another quiet shift happens in how you handle ambition. You still aim high, you still pursue progress, but your goals become clearer because they are examined. You no longer chase outcomes just because they look impressive from the outside. You ask whether they align with your values, your strengths, and your long-term direction. This alignment reduces internal conflict. Many people achieve external success while feeling internally fragmented. They built something impressive, but on assumptions they never questioned. They followed paths they never examined deeply. Critical thinking protects you from that misalignment. It ensures that what you build externally reflects what you believe internally. There is also a greater sense of proportion that develops. When problems arise, you assess them realistically. You do not magnify small setbacks into catastrophic failures. You do not minimize serious risks out of convenience. You measure carefully. Proportion creates emotional balance. This balance allows you to remain calm when others panic and cautious when others become reckless. It keeps you from swinging between extremes. And over time, that steadiness becomes one of your defining traits. You also become more intentional with influence. You recognize that your words, decisions, and reactions shape those around you. If you think lazily, you model laziness. If you react emotionally, you normalize reactivity. But if you evaluate carefully, admit mistakes openly, and adjust when necessary, you model maturity. That example travels further than you realize. At the deepest level, improving critical thinking becomes an act of long-term self-respect. You respect your future enough to think clearly today. You respect your relationships enough to evaluate before reacting. You respect truth enough to revise your beliefs when evidence demands it. And that respect compounds. Year after year, decision after decision, your life reflects the discipline of your mind. Not perfectly, not flawlessly, but noticeably. You waste less time on unnecessary conflict. You recover faster from mistakes. You avoid many preventable risks. You build trust through steady judgment. You grow without becoming rigid. In the end, there is something profoundly freeing about knowing that while you cannot control every outcome, you can control how carefully you think before acting. That control does not guarantee success, but it dramatically increases the likelihood of meaningful, sustainable progress. When you look back decades later, the most important choices in your life will not have been made in moments of noise or emotion. They will have been made in moments of clarity, moments when you paused, reflected, examined assumptions, and chose deliberately. Those moments define direction. And direction, sustained over time, defines destiny. So the real power of critical thinking is not found in debates or intellectual performance. It is found in quiet, daily decisions. In the discipline to question yourself. In the humility to update your beliefs. In the courage to see reality clearly. When you commit to that discipline fully, you do not just improve how you think. You transform how you live. And that transformation, steady, honest, intentional, becomes one of the most valuable investments you will ever make in yourself. If you have come this far, there is only one final truth left to face. Clarity is not a destination you arrive at once. It will tempt you with easy narratives. It will pressure you with urgency. It will reward speed over depth. And slowly, if you are not careful, you can drift back into automatic patterns. That is why the real mastery of critical thinking lies in maintenance. Maintenance means you keep questioning even when you are confident. You keep listening even when you disagree. You keep examining your motives even when your decisions appear justified. You do not assume that past clarity guarantees future clarity. Complacency is subtle. It often appears right after success. When things are going well, you feel less need to analyze deeply. You trust your instincts without verifying them. You stop seeking opposing perspectives. And that is precisely when blind spots begin forming. A disciplined thinker never fully relaxes their standards. Not in a tense or obsessive way, but in a steady, grounded way. They understand that the mind is influenced by environment, emotion, fatigue, and repetition. They protect their reasoning the way a craftsman protects their tools. You begin to notice that clarity requires input quality. What you read matters. What you watch matters. Who you spend time with matters. Conversations shape perception. Information shapes interpretation. Over time, repeated exposure becomes belief. So you curate carefully. You seek depth over noise. You prefer long-form reflection over fragmented headlines. You value thoughtful dialogue over reactive commentary. Not because you want to isolate yourself, but because you understand that your mind absorbs what it consumes. This awareness changes your daily habits. You pause before sharing information. You verify before forming strong opinions. You ask yourself whether you are reacting to facts or to presentation. And perhaps most importantly, you continue refining self-awareness. You observe your patterns under stress. Do you become defensive? Impatient? Overconfident? Withdrawn? Instead of judging yourself harshly, you analyze these tendencies calmly. You prepare for them. You create strategies to manage them before they escalate. Preparation strengthens resilience. Over years, this consistent mental hygiene builds something rare: intellectual integrity. Integrity means your thinking remains aligned with evidence, even when evidence challenges your preferences. It means you value truth over comfort. It means you resist distorting reality. For emotional relief, this kind of integrity builds deep trust. People may not always agree with you, but they recognize consistency. They see that your conclusions follow reasoning, not convenience. And internally, integrity builds peace. There is no hidden conflict between what you know and what you claim. No silent tension between evidence and ego. You stand on reasoning you have tested honestly. At this stage, you also accept that no human being is perfectly objective. Bias will always exist in some form, but awareness reduces its power. When you acknowledge the possibility of bias, you remain open to correction. Correction no longer feels humiliating. It feels productive. This mindset keeps you evolving. It prevents stagnation. It keeps your thinking alive rather than rigid. Eventually, you may realize that critical thinking has changed more than your decisions. It has changed your character. You are slower to anger, slower to judge, slower to assume, faster to listen, faster to reflect, faster to admit when you are wrong. That transformation is profound, because while intelligence can impress people temporarily, character sustains respect over a lifetime. In a fast, moving world, where opinions form in seconds and spread instantly, the ability to pause and think deeply becomes a quiet superpower. It protects you from manipulation. It shields you from unnecessary regret. It strengthens your influence. It grounds your ambition. And yet, it remains simple at its core. Pause, question, examine, adjust, repeat. Again and again, through every stage of life, there will always be new challenges, new information, new complexities. But if you commit to maintaining clarity, not occasionally, but consistently, you will continue growing long after others settle into fixed assumptions. In the end, improving critical thinking is not about becoming the smartest person in the room. It is about becoming the most honest with yourself. And when honesty guides your thinking, your actions follow with strength and steadiness. That steady alignment between thought, word, and action becomes the foundation of a life lived deliberately, not perfectly, not effortlessly, but consciously. And that consciousness, sustained over decades, becomes wisdom in its truest form. By now, the idea should feel clear. Critical thinking is not a dramatic sense of fame or recognition, but the everyday legacy of influence. The habits you pass down, the standards you normalize, the tone you set in your family, your workplace, your community. Because the way you think does not stay contained within you. If you think impulsively, others adapt to that unpredictability. If you overreact, others learn to walk carefully around you. If you refuse to question yourself, others stop offering honest feedback. But when you think carefully, admit uncertainty openly, and adjust when necessary, you create a culture of reflection. You give people permission to think. That influence is powerful. Children raised around thoughtful questioning often grow into independent thinkers. Teams led by measured decision makers develop stronger judgment themselves. Relationships grounded in calm analysis tend to experience fewer destructive conflicts. Your thinking becomes contagious, in the best way. There is also a long-term peace that emerges when you consistently live this way. You stop replaying conversations in your head wondering why you reacted so strongly. You stop carrying regret over impulsive decisions. You stop feeling internally divided between what you know is right and what you chose in the moment. That internal alignment reduces noise. When your thoughts are examined before they become actions, you create fewer emotional messes to clean up later. Life feels lighter not because it is easier, but because you are not adding unnecessary complications. And over time, you begin to appreciate how rare this discipline truly is. Many people are intelligent, many are talented, many are ambitious, but fewer are willing to confront their own biases consistently. Fewer are willing to pause when their ego feels threatened. Fewer are willing to say, calmly, I may be wrong. That sentence alone carries enormous strength. It keeps conversations open. It keeps growth alive. It keeps relationships flexible. The final stage of mature thinking is not about constant analysis. It is about balance. Knowing when to examine deeply and when to trust well-developed intuition. Because after years of disciplined reflection, your intuition itself becomes refined. It is no longer raw impulse. It is compressed experience. But even refined intuition is tested gently against reason. You never fully surrender to blind reaction again. As life progresses, you may notice something almost paradoxical. The more you think clearly, the simpler your decisions often become. Not simplistic, simple. You see through unnecessary drama. You recognize distractions quickly. You understand trade-offs more easily. Clarity reduces confusion. And when confusion reduces, confidence grows naturally. Not the loud confidence of someone who believes they are always right, but the grounded confidence of someone who trusts their evaluation process. That process becomes your anchor. No matter the industry you work in, the role you occupy, or the stage of life you enter, the ability to think critically remains relevant. Trends change. Technology evolves. Skills become outdated. But disciplined reasoning remains timeless. It allows you to adapt. It allows you to pivot. It allows you to rebuild. And perhaps that is the ultimate gift of improving critical thinking, adaptability with integrity. You are flexible without being unstable, open-minded without being gullible, confident without being rigid, humble without being uncertain of yourself. This balance does not happen by accident. It is built choice by choice, conversation by conversation, reflection by reflection. When you look back across the years, you may not remember every detail of your decisions, but you will recognize the pattern. A life guided less by impulse and more by intention, less by assumption and more by understanding. That pattern becomes your signature. In the end, the journey of improving critical thinking is deeply personal. No one else can do the work for you. No one else can examine your assumptions, question your motives, or refine your reasoning on your behalf. But once you commit to that work, the rewards compound quietly. Stronger judgment, deeper relationships, greater resilience, clearer direction, steadier character, and above all, a life that feels consciously lived rather than accidentally drifted. When your thinking is deliberate, your path becomes deliberate. And that quiet deliberateness, sustained over a lifetime, becomes the mark of a truly mature mind. At the very end of this long reflection, there is a quiet realization that ties everything together. The mind you build is the life you experience. Not the circumstances, not the titles, not the possessions. The mind. Two people can live through similar events and walk away with completely is interpretation. It is the discipline of thought applied consistently over time. And that discipline is a choice renewed daily. Critical thinking, at its highest level, is no longer about correcting logical fallacies or identifying weak arguments. It becomes about living consciously. It becomes about refusing to drift mentally, about refusing to let emotion make permanent decisions in temporary storms. You begin to notice how often the world invites you to react quickly. News cycles demand instant opinions. Social pressure demands immediate alignment. Conversations escalate rapidly. But you are no longer pulled by that urgency. You have trained yourself to pause. That pause is powerful. Inside that pause, you examine your assumptions. You check your emotional state. You ask what evidence actually supports your conclusion. You consider alternative explanations. And then, only then, you respond. This rhythm, pause, evaluate, act, becomes second nature. Over years, it quietly shapes your destiny. You choose partners more carefully. You manage finances more prudently. You commit to opportunities more intentionally. You exit situations more thoughtfully. Each decision may seem small in isolation, but together they form a trajectory. Trajectory is everything. A small shift in reasoning today can lead to a dramatically different destination years from now. That is why the discipline of thinking clearly compounds like an investment. It may not feel dramatic in the moment, but over time, its effects become unmistakable. Another deep shift at this stage is acceptance. You accept that you will never eliminate all bias. You accept that you will sometimes misjudge. You accept that uncertainty is permanent. But instead of resisting these realities, you work with them. You build margin into your decisions. You leave room for correction. You create feedback loops. You listen for signals that suggest adjustment is necessary. This flexibility prevents rigidity, and rigidity is often the downfall of otherwise capable people. The strongest thinkers remain students. They do not graduate from learning. They do not cling to outdated beliefs for the sake of pride. They evolve. They refine. They question even their most comfortable conclusions. That humility keeps the mind alive. As you continue this path, you may find that your internal dialogue becomes calmer, less dramatic, less extreme. You stop speaking to yourself in absolutes. You stop labeling every setback as failure and every success as proof of superiority. Your thinking becomes balanced. Balance creates endurance. Endurance allows you to sustain effort through difficulty. It allows you to remain steady when progress feels slow. It allows you to avoid burnout caused by emotional swings. Eventually, the practice of critical thinking integrates fully into who you are. You do not have to remind yourself constantly to analyze. It happens naturally. You do not have to force yourself to consider consequences. Your mind moves there automatically. And that is when you realize the transformation is complete. You are no longer trying to think better. You simply do. Your reactions are measured. Your conclusions are reasoned. Your confidence is grounded. Your humility is genuine. And perhaps most importantly, your life feels intentional. You are not drifting through circumstances. You are navigating them. In the end, improving critical thinking was never about mastering arguments or winning debates. It was about mastering yourself, your impulses, your assumptions, your emotional extremes, your blind spots. It was about building an inner framework strong enough to carry you through uncertainty without losing direction. When you build that framework patiently and protect it consistently, you create something rare, a stable inner compass in an unstable world. And with that compass, you do not need constant external reassurance. You do not need immediate validation. You trust your process. You evaluate carefully. You move deliberately. That quiet trust becomes freedom. Freedom from manipulation. Freedom from impulsive regret. Freedom from unnecessary chaos. And in that freedom, you discover something profound. A well-trained mind is not just a tool for success. It is the foundation of a life lived with clarity, strength, and enduring wisdom.